I'm Helen, and I was raised in a normal middle-class household. Dad was a mechanic, while Mom worked as a nurse. Although we were not wealthy, we had enough to live comfortably. I was hired at a public elementary school in my hometown after earning a degree in teaching from college. Lesson planning, finger drawings, and children's contagious laughter occupied my days. My closest friend Sarah suggested that I go to her party one Friday night. I reluctantly gave in. I put on a plain blue dress and went to the location that Sarah had texted me. When I got there, the party was in full gear and the tiny flat was filled with strangers. Helen. Through the din came Sarah's voice. She materialized at my side, beaming broadly. I'm so happy you came. You should meet someone I want you to. She was dragging me through the crowd before I could object. We came to a halt in front of a tall, attractive man with warm brown eyes and dark hair. Helen, this is Jack, Sarah remarked with a real smile. Helen, please meet my best friend Jack. Jack held out his hand with a smile. Helen, nice to meet you. I've learned a lot about you from Sarah. We struck up a casual conversation about our mutual love of vintage films, my career, and his work as a software developer. Hours had gone by before I realized, and the celebration was coming to an end. Jack came up to me as I was about to leave. Helen, I had a great time speaking with you tonight. Do you think we should get coffee sometime? A beat skipped in my heart. That sounds good to me, I said, attempting to maintain my composure. We traded phone numbers, and I was ecstatic to leave the party. Jack texted me, "Good morning, Helen," when I woke up the following morning. Would you want some coffee? This afternoon, are you free? I promptly replied, and we arranged to meet at a nearby cafe. That coffee date marked the start of something extraordinary. In the ensuing weeks, Jack and I had frequent encounters. We went on lengthy walks in the park, tried out new eateries, and went to the movies. I could feel my feelings for him growing with every date. About a month after we first met, Jack took me out to supper at a classy restaurant one evening. He stretched across the table and grasped my hand as we concluded our dinner. Helen, he whispered, serious eyes. I think you're great. Would you be interested in becoming my girlfriend? My heart leaped for joy. It would be a pleasure to be your girlfriend, Jack. Jack was humorous, compassionate, and supportive. Everything I could have asked for in a companion. I turned to Jack one evening while we watched an old black and white movie together on my couch. Have you mentioned us to your parents? I tried to ask in a casual manner. Jack's body stiffened a little. Not yet, he answered, keeping his gaze glued to the television. I haven't discovered the ideal time. I will notify them at the appropriate time. I wanted to ask more questions, but Jack's attitude prevented me from doing so. Rather, I pressed myself into him and forgot about my worries. I asked Jack to supper at my folks' place the following week. I was eager for my parents to meet the man I was falling in love with, as they had been requesting to see him for weeks. I grinned and said, Mom, Dad, this is Jack, as we entered the living room. Jack was enthusiastically welcomed by my parents. After Mom had cooked her renowned pot roast, we all enjoyed a delicious meal. Jack enthralled my parents with tales of his travels and career, and the discussion flowed smoothly. As Jack went to collect our jackets, my parents pulled me away, capping an amazing evening. My mother hugged me and whispered, He's wonderful, honey. We're very pleased for you. Jack and I were driving home when I felt compelled to bring up his parents once more. Why haven't you yet given me a tour of your family, Jack? Do you feel embarrassed about me? Jack gripped the steering wheel more tightly. Naturally not, Helen. Simply said, My parents can be a little challenging at times. I want to confirm that the time is appropriate. Though I wasn't quite satisfied with his response, I sighed and chose to move on for the time being. Over the next year and a half, our connection got even stronger. But his parents' problem persisted as a tender point. Jack would always find a way to divert the conversation or make light of the circumstance whenever I brought it up. I made an effort to be patient and believe that he had good intentions, but I couldn't get rid of the impression that he was keeping something from me. Then everything changed one bright October evening. At a restaurant, Jack asked me to marry him, and I accepted to the cheers of other patrons. Still thrilled with anticipation, I turned to Jack on the way home. I am eager to inform my folks. Their excitement will be immense. Jack grinned, but there was a trace of anxiety in his look. It's actually time for you to meet my folks, Mel. How about this weekend we go see them? Though I was taken aback by the abrupt change of heart, I was nevertheless happy. Really? That would be really fantastic. I was speechless when we pulled up to Jack's childhood house. The mansion was vast, featuring immaculate lawns and a circular driveway featuring a fountain. I saw 3 expensive cars in the parking lot that probably cost more than I make in a year. Jack, you never told me your family was so rich, I muttered, my eyes wide. He gave a discomfiting shrug. It didn't seem to matter. Come on, let's enter now. The front door swung wide as we got closer, revealing a statuesque woman in an elegant-looking suit and neatly coiffed hair. She yelled, "Jack, darling!" and grabbed him tightly. Her gaze settled on me, and I noticed a glint of disappointment on her face. With a considerably colder tone, she said, "And you must be Helen." "I am Jack's mother, Victoria. Please enter." Richard, Jack's father, was waiting for us in an opulent living room, so we followed her inside. He gave us a kind greeting and firmly shook my hand. He grinned and continued, "So, you're the young lady who's stolen our Jack's heart." Victoria motioned for us to have a seat before starting her questioning. "Helen, tell us a little bit about yourself. What is your line of work?" "I teach at Jefferson Elementary," I answered, attempting to maintain my composure. "3rd grade is what I teach." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "What a cute instructor you are. And your relatives, what are they up to?" As I described my parents' jobs, I noticed Victoria's displeased frown became wider. The room had become tight by the time I was done. Victoria smiled tightly. "Well, Helen," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I must say, you're not quite what I had in mind for Jack. You're simply not the kind of girl I envisioned as a daughter-in-law." I felt as if I'd been slapped. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Richard cleared his throat. "Victoria, that's enough. Jack is old enough to make his own decisions about who he wants to marry." Victoria pursed her lips, but said nothing more. The rest of the visit passed in uncomfortable small talk until Jack and I made our excuses to leave. As we drove home in silence, I finally let the tears fall. "They hate me, don't they?" I choked out. Jack reached over and took my hand. "They don't hate you, Mel. My mother, she's just very particular. That's why I put off this meeting for so long. I'm sorry you had to go through that." In the months following our engagement, Jack and I threw ourselves into wedding planning. We wanted a small, intimate ceremony with just our closest friends and family. However, Victoria had other ideas. One afternoon, as Jack and I were discussing potential venues, my phone rang. It was Victoria. "Helen, dear," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "I've been thinking about your wedding. I've taken the liberty of contacting some of the finest venues in the city. Oh, and I have a list of at least 100 guests we simply must invite." I felt my stomach drop. "That's very kind of you, Victoria. But Jack and I were hoping for something smaller." "Nonsense," she interrupted. "My son is getting married. It has to be a grand affair. I want all my friends to see how happy he is." The next day, we met with Victoria to discuss the wedding plans. Jack was firm, explaining that we wanted a small ceremony, and couldn't afford an extravagant affair. Victoria's face turned cold. I see. Well, if that's how you feel, perhaps I should withdraw my offer to help. After all, it seems you two have it all figured out. Despite the tension, we stood our ground. In the end, we planned the wedding we wanted. A simple ceremony in a local park followed by a reception at a charming restaurant. The morning of the wedding arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves. The ceremony was beautiful. Jack's eyes filled with tears as I walked down the aisle, and when we said our vows, I felt like my heart might burst with happiness. During the toasts, Victoria stood up, glass in hand. My stomach clenched, dreading what she might say. "Well," she began, her voice carrying across the room, "this certainly isn't the wedding I envisioned for my son, but I suppose we must make do with what we have." A shocked murmur ran through the guests. Victoria continued, her words becoming increasingly critical of the simple decorations, the food, and even my dress. With each word, I felt smaller and more humiliated. Finally, she turned her gaze directly to me. "I must say, I'm not entirely comfortable in this company. I think it's best if I take my leave early." With that, she set down her glass and swept out of the room, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Our friends and family rallied around us, offering words of support and trying to lift the mood. Gradually, the party resumed, and by the end of the night, Victoria's dramatic exit was almost forgotten in the joy of celebration. After our honeymoon, Jack and I settled into married life in his apartment. However, my happiness was short-lived, as Victoria began to make her presence felt in increasingly intrusive ways. One afternoon, I came home early from school to find Victoria in our living room, rearranging our furniture. I was shocked to see her there, especially since we hadn't given her a key. When Jack got home, I told him what had happened. He looked uncomfortable, but promised to talk to his mother about boundaries. However, Victoria's unexpected visits continued. She'd show up unannounced, always with some excuse about helping or checking on us. One day, as I was leaving for work, I overheard Victoria talking to our neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, in the hallway. I stopped short when I heard my name. "You know, you really should keep an eye on Helen," Victoria was saying in a low voice. "She comes from a less desirable area. One can never be too careful with their jewelry." Over the next few weeks, I noticed a change in how some of our neighbors treated me. Friendly smiles were replaced with wary glances, and casual conversations in the elevator became awkward silences. It was clear that Victoria's words had had an effect. I broke down in tears as I told Jack what I'd overheard. He was angry and immediately confronted his mother, demanding she return the spare key she'd somehow obtained. Victoria's response was to play the victim, accusing me of turning her son against her. She began posting thinly veiled criticisms of me on social media, never mentioning me by name, but making it clear who she was talking about. Then, one day, I was called into the principal's office at school. Mr. Thompson, my boss, looked uncomfortable as he slid an envelope across his desk to me. "Helen, we received this complaint about you," he said, his voice kind but concerned. "Normally, we don't put much stock in anonymous letters, but given the nature of the accusations, I felt I should bring it to your attention." With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and read the letter. It was a litany of false accusations, everything from theft to inappropriate behavior with students. My mind raced. There was only one person who could be behind this: Victoria. Mr. Thompson assured me he didn't believe the accusations, but warned me that rumors had started circulating among some of the staff. As I left his office, I could feel the stares of my colleagues and hear the whispers behind my back. As the months passed, what should have been joyous family gatherings turned into nightmarish ordeals. Every holiday, every family dinner, became an opportunity for Victoria to belittle and humiliate me in front of Jack's friends and relatives. The breaking point came at a party Victoria hosted at her home. I'd worn a simple white skirt, feeling pretty and confident for once. As the evening wore on, I noticed people giving me odd looks and snickering behind their hands. It wasn't until Jack arrived late and pulled me aside that I learned the horrifying truth. "Mel," he said, his face a mix of anger and embarrassment. "There's a huge red stain on the back of your skirt. It looks like ketchup." My cheeks burned with humiliation as I realized I'd been walking around all evening with this stain, completely unaware. But worse was to come. Victoria had been busy taking photos of me throughout the night, always angled to prominently display the stain. By the time we got home, these photos were all over social media, accompanied by Victoria's mocking comments. The next day at school was a nightmare. Some of my students had seen the photos, and I could hear their whispered jokes and giggles. It took all my strength not to break down in tears in front of my class. That evening, I told Jack I couldn't take it anymore. "I'm done with these family gatherings," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't keep subjecting myself to your mother's cruelty." To my relief, Jack agreed. "You're right, Mel. We'll stop attending. My mother's behavior is unacceptable." Amidst this turmoil, I discovered I was pregnant. For a brief, shining moment, I hoped this news might soften Victoria's heart. Perhaps the prospect of a grandchild would bring peace to our fractured family. I couldn't have been more wrong. Victoria's reaction to the news was chilling. "Are you sure it's his?" she asked, her voice dripping with insinuation. "After all, you two haven't been around much lately. Who knows what you've been up to?" I was stunned by her accusation, but I soon realized it was more than just cruel words. I began to notice a car following me on my way to and from work. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but the same nondescript sedan kept appearing wherever I went. Shaken, I called the police. To my shock, when they tracked down and questioned the man, he admitted he was a private detective hired by Victoria to follow me. She had convinced herself that I was cheating on Jack and that the baby wasn't his. When Jack found out, he was livid. He confronted his mother in a heated phone call that I could hear from across the room. Victoria, caught red-handed, had no choice but to call off the detective. Months passed, and soon it was time for our baby to arrive. The delivery was long and difficult, but when I finally held our son in my arms, all the pain melted away. However, as I looked at him, I noticed something unexpected. Our beautiful baby boy had a much darker complexion than either Jack or me. He looked almost biracial. A seed of doubt planted itself in my mind. Would Jack think I'd been unfaithful? Before he could voice any suspicions, I insisted on a DNA test. The wait for the results was agonizing, but finally we got the news. Jack was indeed our son's biological father. The doctor, seeing our confusion, suggested another possibility. "It's possible this trait comes from one of your parents. We could do DNA tests on them as well to trace the genetic line." My parents, when approached with the idea, were calm and agreeable. They understood our confusion and were happy to help solve the mystery. But the thought of telling Victoria made my blood run cold. Given her past accusations and behavior, I feared how she might react to this news. Would she use this as ammunition in her ongoing campaign against me? As I cradled our beautiful, mysterious baby boy, I looked at Jack. "What are we going to do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jack took my hand, his eyes full of love and determination. "We're going to love our son no matter what, and we'll get to the bottom of this together." The day Victoria first saw her grandson should have been a joyous occasion. Instead, it turned into a nightmare. As soon as she laid eyes on our beautiful baby boy, her face contorted with shock and disgust. "What is this?" she shrieked, recoiling from the crib. "This child is too dark. He can't be Jack's." Before I could even respond, she rounded on me, her eyes blazing with fury. You You cheated on my son with some black guy from the alley, didn't you? Victoria, please, I begged, tears welling in my eyes. We've done a DNA test. Jack is the father. I've never been unfaithful. But she was beyond reason. She stormed out of our apartment, and I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. A few hours later, when I returned from a quick errand, I found all of my belongings strewn across the hallway outside our apartment. Clothes, books, even my underwear, all scattered on the floor for anyone to see. I stood there, shocked and humiliated, as neighbors peeked out of their doors to see what the commotion was about. Jack was livid when he came home and saw what his mother had done. He immediately called her, putting her on speakerphone so I could hear. "Mom, this has to stop," he shouted. "We've done a DNA test. I am the father. Helen has never cheated on me." Victoria's voice was cold and dismissive. "DNA tests can be faked. I know what I see." We even had my parents take DNA tests, which confirmed their relationship to our son. But Victoria refused to listen to reason. When we suggested she and Jack's father take tests as well, she categorically refused. Victoria's obsession only grew worse over time. She began calling me from unknown numbers, leaving threatening voicemails. "Admit you cheated, or I'll destroy both your careers," she hissed in one particularly chilling message. She even sent compromising letters to both Jack's workplace and my school. The stress became so overwhelming that I had to quit my job and find a position at another school across town. But even that wasn't enough. Victoria's campaign of harassment escalated. She planted threatening letters in our mailbox and even went so far as to hire actors to harass me in public, taking photos of these staged encounters and sending them to Jack as proof of my infidelity. One night, as we lay in bed both too stressed to sleep, I turned to Jack. "I'm worried about your mother," I whispered. "This behavior, it's not normal. I think she might need help." Jack nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing, but she'd never agree to see someone." The next day, I decided to reach out to Jack's father, Richard. We met at a quiet cafe away from prying eyes. Over coffee, I poured out everything that had been happening: the harassment, the threats, the elaborate schemes Victoria had concocted. Richard listened, his face growing more and more concerned. When I finished, he sat back with a heavy sigh. "I've noticed changes in her behavior," he admitted, "but I had no idea it had gotten this bad. You're right, she needs help, but she'd never agree to see a psychiatrist willingly." We spent the next hour brainstorming how we could get Victoria the help she clearly needed without her knowing. Richard's plan was simple, but effective. Under the guise of changing insurance providers, he convinced Victoria to undergo a comprehensive health checkup at a new clinic. To our surprise, she agreed without much fuss. The day of the examination arrived, and we all waited anxiously for the results. When they came, they were more shocking than any of us could have imagined. Victoria was diagnosed with a complex mental illness, one that was genetically transmitted through the female line in her family. The doctor explained that without early intervention, the women in her family tended to experience severe mental health deterioration as they aged. Victoria's erratic behavior and obsessive actions were symptoms of this progressive condition. The news hit us all hard, but it also brought a sense of relief. There was a reason for Victoria's actions, a medical explanation for the torment she had put us through. With the diagnosis came a treatment plan, and Victoria was admitted to a specialized clinic for care. But the revelations didn't stop there. Richard, in an attempt to understand the genetic components of Victoria's condition, decided to undergo genetic testing himself. The results shook our family to its core. Richard was not Jack's biological father. When Richard shared this news with us, the pieces suddenly fell into place. It wasn't me who had been unfaithful. It was Victoria, years ago, with a man of African descent. The very thing she had accused me of. Richard's response startled me because I was expecting him to be irate or resentful. With tears in his eyes, he turned to face Jack and stated, "Son, you may not have me as your biological father, but I raised you. Nothing will ever make up for the fact that I have loved you from the day you were born. In every meaningful way, you are my son." Jack gave Richard a strong embrace, reaffirming that Richard was and would always be his father. Jack came to the conclusion that he was not interested in looking for his biological father. "My real father is the man who raised me and supported me through everything," he proclaimed. After Victoria had the treatment she required and the truth was revealed, our family felt more at ease. Richard became a loving grandfather to our son after he was freed from Victoria's control. Playing with him for hours, he would be mesmerized by his gorgeous blue eyes and curling black hair. Richard surprised us one evening while we were seated in his roomy living room with a proposal. He proposed, "Why don't you all move in here? I would really like to have my family close by, but this place is too big for just me." Jack and I looked at each other, then grinned. It seemed appropriate, like we were all starting a new chapter. We moved into Richard's house a few weeks after we reached an agreement. Life found a more contented rhythm. Our son developed into a deserving young man with traits that reflected his blended ancestry. However, to us and everyone acquainted with our family history, his looks were just a reflection of his true nature as a lovely, cherished youngster. Victoria stayed in the clinic and got the assistance she required. Despite our few visits, we took care to ensure her comfort and well-being. Although the resolution wasn't ideal, it was one we could accept.